Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 12th Annual Getzen Lecture on Government Accountability, hosted by the Department of Public Administration and Policy in the School of Public and International Affairs. I'm Matt Auer. I'm the Dean of the school. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to recognize a few people who have joined us today, particularly from SPIA. I see the Lofts have joined us, and let's see who else. I don't have my distance. Well, I'll just point out to Brad, because Brad Wright is the department head for public administration policy. There are a lot of SPIA folks here, so thank you for coming, and many others from the university and the community. I also wanted to recognize some people who made this event possible today. In particular, Laura Bain. I think I saw Laura at one point. She may have run out to find the caterer, and that's very important. Also, I understand we're competing with free ice cream outside, so you've chosen wisely. And then Lauren Ledbetter, who's taking pictures, were key from SPIA in organizing this event and working with our speaker. And then also Catherine Getzen Willoughby, year after year has made this event possible. She's an alumna with a PhD from our program and also a distinguished faculty member at SPIA. And Dan Hall Willoughby, he's a graduate of the UGA Law School. This lecture honors Catherine's parents, Evangeline and Forrest, who are lifelong advocates for public service and education, so thank you to them. So please allow me to introduce this year's Getzen lecturer. Walter Shaub, Jr., former director of the United States Office of Government Ethics, joined the Campaign Legal Center as Senior Director of Ethics in July of 2017. Mr. Shaub served as Director of OGE from 2013 to 2017, was Deputy Director starting in 2008, and held other leadership positions in OGE. And prior to that, and earlier still, he served as staff attorney in several other federal agencies. And there's more to his bio, but you can see that he's been a watchdog for the public trust for many years. Mr. Shaub's work should be considered in historical context in a nation that has been buffeted by corruption and conflict of interest in the executive branch on many occasions over hundreds of years. There have been times when the American experiment with democracy has been nearly jeopardized by pervasive corruption and lax oversight in government, and by the public disgust and demoralization that followed. So the stakes are high for the Office of Government Ethics. OGE prevents conflict of interest and corruption, and it helps federal agencies to straighten out and fly right, to do the right thing. But at times, it squares off with very powerful actors who insist on one set of norms for you and a different code of conduct for themselves. It doesn't sound like easy work, frankly, but Mr. Shaub discharged these high-stakes responsibilities for the better part of 15 years in leadership roles at OGE. And today, he's one of the most articulate voices and experts on executive branch ethics in the nation. It's an honor to hear his thoughts today as the 2018 Getzen Lecturer on Government Accountability. Walter Shaub, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Well, as you may know, particularly after that introduction, I used to lead a small government agency called the Office of Government Ethics, or OGE. And for millions of federal employees, OGE and the ethics program it oversees have long been part of their daily work lives. But before last year, not many people outside of government had ever even heard of the agency. You don't hear much about government ethics when things are going relatively well. Obviously, that's changed. These days, we hear about problems with ethics in our government all of the time. In fact, it's hard to keep up with the scandals, with one shocking, unprecedented story after another. And sometimes it even feels like the news is coming at us out of a fire hose. This is cause for alarm because it means the government ethics program is struggling right now. And that program is an important safeguard in government. It ensures the integrity of the government's operations, and it serves to hold officials accountable to the people they serve. In America, our leaders work for us. We entrust them with authority, and we expect them to use that authority for the benefit of the public and not just to benefit themselves. There's a definition of corruption that's gained currency in the international community, which holds that corruption is the misuse of entrusted authority for private gain. It undercuts the very concept of government in a representative democracy. Our government leaders aren't representing us at all when they're pursuing their own financial interests, so it gets right at the legitimacy of government. And that's why we need mechanisms that ensure that our leaders don't misuse the power we give them for their own benefit, which is the very reason for the government ethics program. Now, the roots of our ethics program go back a long way. In fact, the very first ethics law I'm aware of was from the 1700s, and it bans a treasury secretary from buying and selling treasuries. And over the years, in response to various crises, the laws evolved. But the seminal turning point really for the ethics program was Watergate. President Nixon's actions had left a lot of Americans questioning whether there was anything about government they could ever trust again. And Congress felt an urgent need to respond to try to restore faith in government. So they passed the Ethics in Government Act, which established the Office of Government Ethics and built a comprehensive ethics program. Each branch of the federal government got its own supervising ethics office, both the legislative, judicial, and the executive branch. Today I want to take a look at the executive branch ethics program because it's the strictest of the three and by far the largest, with 2.7 million civilian federal employees covered by it and all uniformed officers of the military. And there's a separate joint ethics regulation modeled on the ethics rules for enlisted people. The purpose of that program is prevention. The idea is to prevent problems before they arise, because the idea is it's better to have a government free of ethical problems than to just simply seek to punish those who commit violations, that is. And the program focuses on several aspects of integrity in government. The first and most obvious is conflicts of interest, with the idea that you can't participate in a matter as a government official if you have a financial interest in that matter. It also focuses on impartiality by saying you have to stay out of matters involving business associates and family members and others you have a connection to. There are rules on misuse of position, so you can't help somebody you're connected to using your government authority or endorse businesses. Or there's a law called the Hatch Act that prohibits you from using your governmental authority to influence a partisan political election. We also have rules on gifts so that government officials don't create the appearance of impropriety. You know, in many cases, the gifts they might get are not so significant that it would actually influence them, but the public shouldn't have to worry about what is the exact dollar level that's going to corrupt a government official. And so we pretty much ban all gifts with very limited, narrow exceptions. Another part of what I call the ethics program that sometimes people don't think of as part of the ethics program is the merit systems principles, which started in the 1880s when Congress replaced the spoils system with a merit-based system so that most of the government's activities would be carried out by officials hired based on merit rather than political affiliation. The idea was to ensure that government services are delivered by officials who serve the American people instead of their political patrons. Now, carrying out this program in the executive branch is the Office of Government Ethics and ethics agencies in every single agency in the government. OGE only has about 70 employees, which doesn't even make it a small agency or even a micro agency. It's more like a nano agency in the vast expanse of the federal government. But there are another 4,500 agency ethics officials embedded in the various agencies. And OGE doesn't supervise them directly, but serves as an objective influence in the central component of this otherwise decentralized program. Sometimes an ethics official who works for an agency manager might be intimidated to stand up to them or might even be captured by them and start trying to help them find ways to get around the rules. in the worst case scenario. I would say I don't think that happens very often, but when it does, OGE is there to prompt them and push them to be a little bit stricter and because OGE can't be retaliated against by the managers in their agencies the way they can. Now, OGE does this, again, not by direct supervision, but by passing regulations that direct how they conduct their activities, and OGE issues interpretive guidance and even gives them direct assistance as agency ethics officials are wrestling with particularly thorny questions so that they can be sure they're advising agency employees and appointees how to carry out their jobs in ways that won't violate the rules. OGE also audits their programs to make sure they've implemented all of the required procedures to have the best chance to foster an ethical culture. And OGE's other activity that's really important is that it works closely with the White House on presidential nominees, reviewing their financial disclosure reports and making sure they sign ethics agreements that commit to resolving their conflicts of interest when they come into government if they're confirmed by the Senate. At the agency level, the same type of work is going on. Agency officials are reviewing financial disclosure forms. In fact, there are about 28,000 public financial disclosure forms that have to get filed each year and another 450,000 confidential forms. So that is a lot of reviewing of financial disclosure forms. And they review them looking for conflicts of interest so that they can help them either recuse, meaning stay out of matters that they have a financial interest in, or divest them if recusing would be impossible because the matter goes right to the core of their essential functions of their job. And those ethics officials out at the agencies conduct training, and they counsel employees individually on such things as whether they need to recuse from a matter involving a former client, or whether they can take the gift of free attendance at an event where some lobbyist or someone might be trying to bend their ear. But what neither OGE nor the agency ethics officials have any power to do is actually enforce the rules. They can't take disciplinary action against employees, and they actually can't even investigate them. In the government, there is another mechanism that can. We have inspectors general in every single large agency, and there are 14,000 auditors, investigators, and support personnel working for these IGs. And if they uncover wrongdoing, agency managers can discipline the offenders. Or if the violation is actually a criminal violation, the Department of Justice can prosecute them. In addition, OGE has always had a very important source of leverage. The White House was always available to support OGE in its dealings with agencies and individual appointees. For a teeny tiny nano agency, OGE had wildly disproportionate access to the White House because in every administration since the enactment of the Ethics in Government Act, the president and his White House was very supportive of OGE and its program. In fact, I worked at OGE under both the Bush and Obama administrations. In the Bush administration in particular, I was handling presidential nominees and dealing with the White House on a daily basis. And I can tell you, I always had a terrific experience with the level of support I got from both the Bush and Obama people. They convinced me that ethics has no party because in Washington, it seemed like the neutral territory was always government ethics and you could count on support. If an agency or an individual official stepped out of line and OGE was unable to get them to do what needed to be done, OGE would go to the White House, and often as early as the next morning, you get a call from a very sheepish individual who'd been taken out behind the woodshed by the White House and was suddenly willing to do what they were resisting doing all along. One other piece of leverage was always available to OGE. In the 1980s, after OGE had existed for a little while, Congress started reviewing its effectiveness. And there were congressional reports issued by the committees that endorsed the idea of OGE going public if necessary. And they said that the idea of going public would be a very good tool to rein somebody in because the consequences of OGE pointing out a breach of ethical norms and a departure from what had always been done would be enough to deter them and get them back in line. And in fact, for the most part, the mere threat of OGE going public was enough in almost every occasion to get people to turn around and do what they needed to do. On only very rare occasions did OGE wind up having to go public. And so overall, it was a fairly robust system for about 4 decades after the enactment of the Ethics in Government Act. And again, both parties had always been supportive of it. Presidents, for instance, were not technically covered by the ethics rules, but past presidents, since the enactment of the Ethics in Government Act, knew it would be wrong to hold themselves to a lower standard than the people who worked for them. The whole idea of ethics in government is to ensure that power is used for the benefit of the people, and nobody has more power than the president, so presidents felt they had to hold themselves to the highest standards. This notion was articulated by the Department of Justice, by OGE, and by the presidents themselves, who understood that their exemption from the ethics rules was not a perk of high office, but merely a practical necessity, because the remedy most often used for conflicts of interest, and the one required by law, is recusal, meaning staying out of things. But it would be inconceivable for a president to recuse, because we need our president to be involved on a moment's notice in any possible matter that could come up. And that's why the presidents instead treated their obligation as one of divestiture, and they would get rid of conflicting financial interests. Now, this tradition held for about 40 years until 2017. At that point, President Trump refused to live up to that honorable tradition and instead vigorously set himself about monetizing the presidency. This came to a head on January 11th, 2017 last year, when he held this showy press conference and stood in front of a mountain of folders and papers that he pretended were for this bogus trust that was supposedly going to resolve his conflicts of interest. And I say bogus because it wasn't blind at all, and it was run by his sons, and the conflict of interest stems from the ownership of assets, not from making day-to-day decisions about a company, and he retained 100% his ownership interest in all of these companies. So in a very literal sense, the trust did absolutely nothing to resolve conflicts of interest. In fact, we later learned that that mountain of papers was a sham too. The White House ultimately had to admit that they were blank and had nothing to do with the setting up of this bogus trust. So in the end, the president remained mired in conflicts of interest for the first time since Watergate. And he set about seeking private gain. He immediately after the election doubled the membership fee at Mar-a-Lago. And he's made frequent visits to that property and all of his others, each trip being an advertisement because the press corps naturally has to come with them, and he uses every opportunity to talk about them. There's the famous video of him standing there in front of the camera talking about what he called the beautiful chocolate cake Mar-a-Lago was serving while he was chucking bombs at Syria. And he's now spent approximately a quarter of his time in office at his own golf courses. That's nearly 1 out of every 4 days he's been president. He's been at his own golf courses. The cost of these trips at our expense has been enormous because you have to take Air Force One, and you have to take the security team with you, and you have to take all of the apparatus to launch a nuclear war, and you have to take all of the officials who are doing business with you while you're going off to the golf course. And so the entire cost at this point may have come to as much as $100 million. OGE's annual budget, by the way, was only $16 million. So you could have more than 5 OGEs for the price of these golf trips. And some of that money has gone directly into his own pockets. By the middle of last year, by the middle of last fall, we learned that the Secret Service had spent over $150,000 just renting golf carts from him for the privilege of driving around and protecting his life. He didn't give them a break on renting those golf carts. And he actively makes private endorsements of books and TV shows and companies. He said you should frequent Eddie Bauer because they supported him in the election. And when he did a press conference from a hurricane-ravaged region and was talking about the human suffering that was being encountered down there, he made sure to wear a cap that he's selling on his website for $45. And he has violated the law by slapping the presidential seal on tchotchkes like mugs and shot glasses that he's selling for a profit, and even ordered some placards with the presidential seal to be put on the tees at his golf courses at Mar-a-Lago. Meanwhile, businesses and charities and politicians and even foreign governments are currying favor with him by renting his properties for events. And they're paying a presidential premium. In its first year, the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. cleared a profit at a time when, as a new hotel, it was expected to lose money. And they didn't make a profit by filling the rooms. In fact, most of the rooms were vacant, or about half of them. But they charged higher than market rates because